Allison. Hi, all. How we doing? Cool. I will say, so as Allison said, I do teach here at Bryant. I normally am teaching the 8 a.m. economics classes. Your great is more feedback verbally than I get at 8 a.m. from the students, so it's appreciated. As Allison said, usually what I get asked a lot is, you're an economist, but you study belonging and identity. Why aren't you talking about unemployment and GDP and growth? And what I usually think about is, if you've taken an economics class before, it might sound familiar to you, but economics is really the study of how people make decisions. Why do we decide to do the things that we do? And as we think about who we try to be in the workplace, we spend a lot of our day trying to decide the type of person we want to be, who we are at our workplace, essentially. And so what I hope you'll kind of go on a quick journey with me is thinking about who you choose to be when you're at work, and how social media, with all its benefits and all its flaws, can help us kind of reflect on the different type of people that we tend to be, and maybe help us get a little bit better at feeling like we belong in the workplace we belong in. Cool? So, thank you for the cools again, by the way. So, humor me a little bit. I know it's the weekend, so maybe you don't want to necessarily do this, but imagine yourself at work, okay? You can close your eyes if you want to, but imagine yourself at work, and maybe depending on how long you've been working, or if you're working at all currently, you might need to head back a little bit, but try to imagine yourself in your first full-time job that you had, whether that's recent or a little bit ago. Imagine yourself, if you graduated from college, you're fresh out of college, you're ready to go in this full-time role, you spent however many years you spent at college, working, studying late at night, spending thousands of dollars to get that degree, and now you are in this job, right? You're ready to roll. And as you're going through all of the kind of daily rigmarole of your job, something just kind of feels off. You know, you're in these meetings, you're sending emails, but you don't necessarily feel like you know all the things that are going on. You see your supervisor, maybe some other people on your team, they just seem to know what they're supposed to be doing. They don't have to spend several minutes thinking about, do I speak up in this meeting or not? They don't spend 3 different edits of an email that's about 5 sentences long trying to figure out, do I add an exclamation point or a period at the end of this email? Trying to figure out, do I fit in, is a real issue currently for early career professionals in the workplace. Any sort of career and life transition is difficult, right? That's why it's a transition. But for the current generation of early career professionals, so we're talking folks from about age 20 to about age 27, there's a real crisis that we're facing currently in the professional workspace, where you may have heard it before, you may have seen it on the news, but this generation's having a real tough time with burnout. Starting their new positions and not feeling like they actually belong. That they know the skills, they've spent all this time in class, they have the ideas that they actually need, but when they, put on their suit and tie, or they get ready to actually go into the office and they're sitting there at their desk, they just don't necessarily feel like part of the team. They have a tough time imagining what the next 5 years looks like, what the next 10 years looks like. And what that's causing is an increasing amount of turnover for companies. Turnover is one of the hardest things if you ask an HR professional. It's one of the costliest things for a company a lot of times. When you're bringing in new employees, you spend all this time training them, and then you have to turn them over when they leave, when they either quit or they're not performing high enough and you have to fire them. This turnover that you have costs not only the time and money you spend for actually getting new people in, but it costs all the actual emotional time for the rest of your employees. And so if you think about this issue of burnout, this issue of not feeling like I am whatever the professional is in my place of work, in my career, I kind of think that you can think about actually reflecting on that a little bit. There's kind of 3 key areas that I want to talk us through that, again, if you've taken a class with me before, I always like to give us some map markers at the start so that you know where we're supposed to end up at the end of the 50 minutes that we're talking, which we're not doing 50 minutes today, don't worry. So we're going to go on sort of three main journeys. One, I want to level the field so we can all get on the same page about what do we mean when we're talking about professionalization. Essentially, what does it mean to be a quote-unquote professional? Then we'll briefly talk about a kind of specific way to think about identity. There's, as we'll see, a whole bunch of different ways you can think about who I am as a person. This is just one of them that even if you don't use social media at all, it's actually, I think, a helpful, just a life thing to have. And then finally, the technology part of this, right? We'll talk about how social media is a really great mirror to understand yourself and understand each other a little bit with some limitations. So hopefully in the next couple of minutes as we go through this, you'll kind of feel like this is the path we're going on. When we talk about professionalization, we're not talking about sort of this, if you can imagine in your head, a curmudgeon-y idea of like you need to like look like a professional, act like a professional. The reason I say that is because the definition of what it looks like to be a professional depends on where we're talking about, right? The idea of what a professional person is supposed to look like and act like and say, on the trading floor is different than the type of professional that would be on the actual construction site, right? And that's not to say one is good and one is bad. They're just different for the scenarios that they're in. When we're talking about professionalization, economists and sociologists, we're generally talking about this wider concept, this sort of process that you go through of understanding these are the traits, the actions, the clothing, the ways of being that somebody in this area, in this industry, is as a professional. Ultimately, it's about understanding the rules. We talk a lot about the power of internships and the power of all this experiential learning that we do here at Bryant, and we say a lot of times the real point of it is to understand better those unwritten rules, right? You can learn all this stuff in classroom, you can learn all this stuff in orientations, but ultimately you're trying to understand all the unwritten rules that go into being a person in this career. And that's this concept of professionalization. A lot of sociologists and researchers will talk about this idea that we're gaining those ideas, those expectations through the interactions we have with each other. That we do it through this one-on-one interaction. You and I are talking to each other in the office. I say something that is maybe not how we talk about things in our company, in our industry. You give me a weird look, or you give me some sort of verbal feedback that I then process as, oh, okay, that wasn't cool. But we also see those interactions with each other. You may be able to pretty easily think of an example of you're sitting at work or just in life in general, and you see two people interacting in the office or just in public, and how they're interacting with each other, you're taking some feedback too of how people talk to each other or interact with each other, right? It's this idea that we gain these ideas about what a professional looks like through our interactions, you and me together, but also through watching people's interactions and seeing the feedback they get. And that's the core crux of it. When we're trying to think about, well, why are new professionals, early career professionals, burning out so much? It's because they're facing this issue of rationalizing and kind of connecting with who we're telling them they're supposed to be at work. Again, this is not like a values judgment thing of whether we're saying that this idea of a professional is right or wrong. It is just a process. This idea of when we're talking about professional identity development, we're talking about some of the technical skills, committing to that role, investing in actually learning more about what the job means. But really, for you and me, our everyday lives, it's this values congruence. You know, when I sit down at my computer, when I show up on the job site, do I feel like the person that I have to be when I'm here aligns more or less with who I feel like I am, quote unquote? That's what we're trying to help with, essentially. And when we talk about people burning out and not feeling like they fit in this role at their company, it's essentially this crux of it, that they don't feel like there is an overlap with who they are enough. And so if you think about that values congruence part of professionalization, the question should become, well, how do we help people get better at that, right? we're hitting this sort of invisible wall where people don't feel like they understand why things aren't clicking for them, why it feels kind of weird and off at their everyday lives, we should equip them with the skills to think about that sort of stuff. And like we said, there's a lot of different ways you can think about identity. But one of my personal favorites is this fine gentleman here. This is Erving Goffman. He's a sociologist. And he developed this whole theory that I will not do the disservice of trying to explain to you fully in the time that we have. But essentially, Erving Goffman comes up with this concept of understanding who we are as people through this self-presentation theory. Essentially, this idea that you and I, in our everyday life, we're acting out these different roles. Depending on the positions that we're in, the environments, the scenarios that we're in throughout our day, we put on these different masks. It's kind of like our conversations with each other, our performances on a stage. So, funnily enough, I am performing to you on a stage, right? That's not to say that they're disingenuous. They are genuine in that moment. But if you think about all the different roles that you may play in your own personal life, you're a different person depending on those positions. The Liam Rice that I am when I am talking to you right now as a TEDx speaker, right, is not necessarily the same Liam Rice that I am when I am having dinner with my mom or when I'm hanging out with my friends, right? Are there common through lines? Yes, you would hope so. But there are differences in the way that we talk, the way that we act. I don't wear this suit every day when I'm hanging out with my friends at home, right? They are different performances. And so Goffman's self-presentation theory basically says, think about identity that way. It is very much like theater, where we put on costumes in theater. That's the clothes that we wear, the haircut we choose, all that sort of stuff. There's scripts. Think about the way that we talk to each other. We have specific slang that we'll use depending on our scenarios. And we are constantly, and this is really the key part, we're constantly getting feedback, subconsciously and consciously. If you say something weird in a conversation that somebody disagrees with, they might tell you, right? And then there's some very clear feedback. But we're also getting feedback by the way you are visually just reacting when I say things, when we're talking to each other. And crucially, because we are human beings wonderfully gifted at rational thinking, we tend to overthink and try to understand, well, what sort of feedback do I think they're giving me? Do they think I am dressed the right way? All that sort of stuff. Every day we are constantly deciding sort of what our identity, what performance, what mask we're going to put on. And self-presentation theory essentially says you do it so often that it starts to just sort of feel natural. If you do this stuff every day growing up, eventually it starts to feel like it's this natural part of you. But again, that can change and differ depending on the situation that you're in. So again, if we're thinking about values congruence, trying to understand people feeling like they belong in the workplace, self-presentation theory is a kind of helpful way to think about it. There is a specific mask that I'm supposed to be putting on at work. Am I? How much does that overlap with the identity that I feel like is my quote-unquote true identity? That's this stuff that is sort of underlying these feelings of belonging that we talk about at work a lot. And so we're trying to improve this stuff, right? We're trying to help people at least be able to understand these feelings a bit more. How do you make this values congruence process a little bit more tangible to look at? And there's really no better picture of who you're trying to be as a person than social media. Social media is a really wonderful thing because even though it is electronic, it's actually very tangible. We're kind of more ephemeral in our daily day stuff, right? When you and I are talking to each other, when we part, I don't see you again necessarily, but when we're choosing to create social media posts online and profiles, there is permanence in there where we can actually go back and look at that stuff. There's a lot of research around social media and thinking of sites as a public or a networked public. So publics, if you go way back to Greek history, these just general public spaces where people would come and just engage with each other. There'd be market transactions, there'd be social interaction, but just this place where you get all together, interact with each other, and then crucially look at each other and see how other people are interacting. And that's what social media is. We have plenty of modern day publics. At the pond, actually, the Bryant Beach out here is one of the best publics on campus for us because you can just see everybody hanging out there. And this researcher, Dana Boyd, has what I think is one of the best books to read, particularly if you have younger children, is essentially this idea of networked publics being a view into these masks that we're trying to make. We're constantly getting interactions with each other, and what makes social media wonderful and also a beast with understanding who we are, there's no more visible feedback than likes and dislikes and reposts and reblogs on your posts online. Who you choose to be is really freed from the physical body in your real world. You get to choose your username online. What profile picture are you going to pick to actually have be your profile? What are the words you're saying? What pictures do you post? All that sort of stuff. They're conscious and subconscious decisions about who you're saying you want to be. And they also let you see how other people interact. One of my favorite examples as we're kind of coming up on the end, again, it's this idea of Finstas. I don't know how many of you out there have a Finsta. There's a couple smirks, so a couple of you definitely do. Finstas are essentially fake Instagrams or secondary Instagrams, where Instagram's a social network site, you post pictures, and what younger people began to feel, they felt very confined by the mask they were asked to portray on Instagram. They felt that they had to be positive, happy, look how successful my life is going. And then all that pressure felt like they could not be who they felt they truly were. And so they created Finstas, secondary Instagrams where they let only a couple people follow and basically post really embarrassing pictures of themselves. Pictures where they thought they looked ugly or silly or, all sorts of things that they would never post on their main feed. This idea of being able to consciously look at who is the person I'm trying to say I am. Ultimately, the irony with Finstas is a lot of people now reported that they felt confined to act a certain way on their Finstas, which is what they were trying to avoid with their regular Instagrams. So ultimately, as we're trying to think about who we want to be at work, who we're trying to say we're supposed to be as professionals, and ultimately trying to retain early career professionals who are the lifeblood of our country, of our economy, for future decades, we want people to feel like they are transitioning into that identity well. And a way that we can help with that, not solve it, right? We can't solve problems for people in that way. But the way that we can help it is encouraging people to be more reflective of the identities they are trying to put on and the identities that they are trying to say we should be in the real world. So I appreciate your time. And yeah,